Wrapping up passages from Scripture which Bob Dutko, evangelical Christian radio talk show host and apologist, claims prove the scientific accuracy and truth of the Bible, we conclude with Bob's observation that the Bible had remarkable insight into the depths of the sea.
You know, they didn't know thousands of years ago that valleys exist on the bottom of the sea. They didn't have sonar. They didn't have the ability to track that information, yet 2 Samuel 22:16 says, "The valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of breath from his nostrils."
The passage from 2 Samuel is a mirror of Psalm 18:15. The psalm itself is believed by scholars to predate the writing of 2 Samuel, so that it was the author of 2 Samuel who copied, nearly directly, the psalm into his book, changing only the Hebrew word for water, mayim, for the Hebrew word yam, or sea. Psalms, as such, are poetic in nature and employ a range of ancient Hebrew literary techniques. Foremost among these are parallelisms. In Psalm 18, we find a number of such parallelisms, and especially in verse 15. The psalm is prefaced as a song given in the day that the Lord delivered David from the hand of all his enemies. The psalm begins with strong parallelisms, referring to God as a rock and a fortress, as a buckler and a horn. As the psalm continues, so do the parallelisms. Verses 7 and 8 are strong examples. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. In the former, the psalmist writes that the earth shook and trembled, and then repeats that imagery by stating the foundations of the hills moved and were shaken. In the latter, the psalmist states that smoke went up out of Jehovah's nostrils, and then that fire went out of his mouth. Parallelism, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, is the regularly recurring juxtaposition of symmetrical constructed sentences. The symmetry is carried out in the substance as well as in the form, and lies chiefly in the relation of the expression to the thought. The same idea is expressed in its full import, that is, in its various aspects and turns, not in a continuous uninterrupted sentence, but in several corresponding clauses or members with different words. There are varying types of parallelisms, but the kind we encounter in Psalm 18 is known as synonymous, in which the same sentiment is repeated in different but equivalent words. Frequently, the second line not merely repeats, but also reinforces or diversifies the idea introduced in the first line. This is what we find in verse 15 of Psalm 18, copied over into 2 Samuel 22:16. The verse reads again in the King James Version, "Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils." The Hebrew word translated channels in the King James and valleys in Dutko's NIV is afik, and refers to a channel or ravine, and isn't necessarily plural. It is most often translated as the singular river, and only as channel in these two verses from Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, as well as verse 7 from Isaiah 8. In fact, Isaiah 8:7 provides us with a clue on how best to translate afik in these other two instances. Isaiah 8:7 reads, "Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come up over all his channels, and go over all his banks." While not strictly poetic in form, this verse nonetheless contains another Hebrew parallelism. Notice how the river is described as coming up over its channels and going over its banks. Banks here provides the parallel with channels and clues us in to how best to understand the Hebrew afik in Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22. What's being described here is that which merely contains the water, as in Psalm 18, or the sea, as in 2 Samuel. This isn't, as the Apologist wishes, a reference to the various valleys and sea trenches weaving their way through the seafloors throughout the planet, but instead a reference to the mere bottom of the ocean. This is clear when the parallelism of the verse is considered. The channel or valley of the sea is paralleled with the foundation of the world. In Hebrew cosmology, the earth rested upon a great body of water supported by pillars. The verse then was simply a reference to this ancient pre-scientific cosmology in which the basin of this vast expanse of water was exposed at the blast of Jehovah's nostrils. The basin of the sea and the foundation holding up the earth were one and the same according to this cosmology. In no sense was this verse, found either in Psalm 18 or 2 Samuel 22, describing the planet in any sort of scientific way. As this episode concludes our examination of Dutko's list of verses proving the truth of the Bible through its array of scientific insights, it should be abundantly obvious that the Apologist has failed to support such a claim. Instead, Dutko engaged in a gross misunderstanding of the contexts from which he pulled his biblical verses, and performed what amounts to little more than post hoc interpretations of the text and circular reasoning. In not a single instance did Dutko provide evidence that the authors of these supposed scientific truths of the Bible actually understood what they were writing as scientific insights. At most, some were vague references to what generally could be matched to a later scientific discovery, while others were selective quotes from a much larger non-scientific context, while still others were nothing more than theological assertions, literary exaggerations, or simple observations of nature. Other ancient cultures outside the Bible actually provide us with startling examples of advanced scientific understanding. Inca surgeons in ancient Peru commonly and successfully removed small portions of patients' skulls to treat head injuries, with survival rates approaching 90%. Inca healers carefully avoided areas of the skull where cutting would be more likely to cause brain injury, bleeding, or infection, and were conducted without the modern benefits of anesthesia and antibiotics. The Chinese did observational and mathematical calculations to conclude the universe and Earth were actually quite old. This view of an ancient world led the Chinese to recognize that fossils were actually the hardened remains of plants and animals that had once been alive. The Chinese too made early star maps which show they understood how to represent on a two-dimensional map things that exist in a curved space. Zhuan Li, who lived in the later Han Dynasty, believed the sun, moon, and stars floated in empty space, opposed to the biblical notion of the heavenly bodies fixed to the solid dome of the Rakia. In 560 BCE, Greek philosopher Xenophanes of Colophon reasoned that land rises when he found fossil seashells atop mountain peaks, a discovery compatible with the modern theory of plate tectonics. And the list goes on, shaming whatever dubious claims apologists concoct for the so-called amazing scientific foresight of the Bible. These are real scientific insights, real advancements in human knowledge, not hitting upon the right day to remove the foreskin of a baby boy's penis through trial and error, not misidentifying the physical composition of stars or making some exaggerated, non-specific claim about their number. The Bible advanced no human understanding about the natural world, made no observations that advanced knowledge about how the world works, no insights into cosmology, biology, geology, or any other field of scientific study. And of course, that is not the fault of the biblical authors. The fault lies in the apologist, who, like a penny-pinching miser, tries to squeeze from the Bible what even looks like something that could pass for scientific knowledge in order to advance their agenda for proving the Bible true, and to sell just one more set of CDs to a gullible audience. The Bible was not meant to forward human scientific understanding, and should not bear the blame for what is claimed on its behalf by scoundrels in Christian apologists' clothing. In our next episode, we will be introducing Bob Dutko's fourth proof for the truth of the Bible, an examination of biblical prophecy. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.